Rosenstein should be recused.
Firing Rob Rosenstein is akin to firing Bob Mueller.
Michael Cohen often recorded his conversation.
It's a gold mine for investigators.
I believe there was a chemical attack.
We're looking very, very seriously, very closely at that whole situation.
The president has authority to act without first coming to Congress.
This is New Day with Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
Welcome to our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is your New Day. It is Friday, April 13th. Friday the 13th.
Thank you for that warning.
And let me tell you, we're going to play on that theme a little bit this morning here at 6 o'clock. Our starting line, the Comey-Trump war is now in full effect. Fired FBI Director Jim Comey's tell-all book is leaking out. Comey portrays the president as unethical and untethered to the truth, compares Mr. Trump to a mafia boss who demands loyalty, and slamming what he calls the forest fire that is the Trump presidency. Now, Comey's account, look, is very personal, and you're going to see things in this book that are unusual to hear from a former official at his level. There's a lot of revenge in this book, as well as telling his side of the story in terms of a factual account. Comey also writes about the president's fixation with having the FBI disprove one of the most salacious details in the infamous Russia dossier. How will the president respond to these revelations? Here's what we know. He is going to respond. And might this change his cooperation with Robert Mueller's investigation? I'm getting a little choked up.
I know you are.
Part of it is my breakfast I got caught eating. The other part is the emotional impact.
I'm glad you've revealed that. I did feel you were cutting it a little close with the scrambled egg today.
You could have told me that before the shovel started coming towards me.
I should have. Meanwhile, sources say the White House is preparing to plan to undermine Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein to make the case that he is too conflicted to oversee Mueller's probe. What exactly will they do? Also, President Trump's Secretary of State nominee, Mike Pompeo, may fall short of the votes that he needs to advance to a vote on the Senate floor. So there are several crises facing the Trump administration. What will they do to get Pompeo confirmed? Let's begin our coverage with CNN's Abby Phillips. She is live at the White House. Another busy day, Abby.
That's right. There's so much to get to this morning, Allison. Already, days before Comey's book is even released, it's already making waves here in Washington, in part because of the stunning rebuke of President Trump's presidency. Comey characterizes him as a liar and as someone who is unconcerned with Russia's threat to American democracy. Fired FBI Director James Comey's takedown of President Trump is nothing short of extraordinary. Comey revealing explosive details about the forest fire that is the Trump presidency. Comey paints the president as a compulsive liar, devoid of human emotion, unethical and untethered to truth and institutional values. His leadership is transactional, ego-driven, and about personal loyalty. Comey recalls his first time meeting the president-elect at an intelligence briefing at Trump Tower, just days before he was sworn in. After briefing him on Russia's meddling in the 2016 election, Comey writes Mr. Trump had this question: "You found out there was no impact on the result, right?" The Washington Post reports that Comey reveals in the book that he was surprised that Mr. Trump did not seem interested in Russia's threat to America, but instead focused on how they could spin what we just told them. The former prosecutor comparing the president's leadership style to that of a mob boss. The silent circle of assent, the boss in complete control, the loyalty oaths, the us versus them worldview, the lying about all things large and small in service of some code of loyalty that put the organization above morality and above the truth. And Comey also talks in this book about his interactions with President Trump at a private dinner that he had, in which the president apparently asked him for loyalty. And here's what he wrote: "I was determined not to give the president any hint of assent to this demand, so I gave silence instead. I stared at the soft white pouches under his expressionless blue eyes. I remember thinking in that moment that the president doesn't understand the FBI's role in American life." Comey also talked a little bit about the back and forth with President Trump over this dossier, the unconfirmed dossier. Some of the allegations in that dossier were so outrageous even to the president that he kept repeatedly asking Comey about them, and even at one point Comey says considered asking him to investigate it. But here's why Comey, the president, was so concerned about it, according to Comey. It bothered him if there was even 1% chance his wife Melania thought it was true. He just rolled on unprompted, explaining why why it couldn't possibly be true, ending by saying he was thinking of asking me to investigate the allegations to prove it was a lie. I said it was up to him. As far as we know, the president didn't direct Comey to investigate one of the more salacious elements of that dossier, which involves that's all I'm going to say about it. But the point is that Comey is really detailing some of the most private moments with President Trump, and also detailing a man who was obsessed with this Russia investigation, but not because of the impact that it would have on American democracy, but rather the impact that it would have on his reputation. Allison and Chris.
Abby, there are some moments they don't teach you in journalism school. I think you might have just encountered one.
But that's okay. Everybody knows what you're talking about, Ev. Don't worry about that. All right, let's discuss the impact with CNN political analysts John Avlon and David Gregory. Brother Gregory, a little bit of Danielle Steele coming at us there with the white pouches under the expressionless blue eyes, a little bit of a bodice ripper. What jumps out at you about what we understand to be in this book so far?
Well, the timing is what jumps out at me. We know this storyline. We know the back and forth between, these two players, the president and Jim Comey. Who is going to be heavily criticized, as he was by Democrats and Republicans later, but Democrats at the time of the election, for how he intervened in this email investigation and tried to manage his media profile and that of the FBI's in a way that was deservedly criticized. But so we know this back and forth. But I think the timing of it now, at this crescendo moment of the Mueller investigation, with the president, making threats about firing the assistant attorney general, I think speaks to one of the most troubling aspects of this presidency, and that is that President Trump does not seem to respect the rule of law or the institutions of law enforcement in our government or our intelligence agencies, and that is a huge problem. I mean, what Comey puts out there again is the fact that when the facts of the Russia meddling became known, without suggesting that it impacted the result of the election, the president didn't seem to care about what the threat was, what the future of the threat was. We have to keep coming back to that. And even the president's defenders have to give some room to say, why doesn't he seem to care about a major threat to this institution? These folks in law enforcement, from the attorney general to his head of the FBI, they believe in the rule of law. They're going to run this stuff down. They do care about that stuff, no matter who appointed them.
Yeah.
And the president seems not to care.
The president doesn't care because he won. He is concerned about questions about illegitimacy in his election, and that seems to be the context in which he cares. But that speaks to, I think, what the story Comey is telling is a president who's untruthful and doesn't seem to care about institutions or have knowledge of them, especially the institution of the presidency, which is a sacred trust with American history and the American people, and that you should care about, things of the national interest that don't affect you or might even reflect badly upon you. What struck me about this isn't just the timing, although I think it's fascinating. It is coming out as the Mueller investigation reaches a crescendo, as he says, but the fact that Comey bringing to bear his professional lifetime of experience in investigating, in particularly the Mafia and the New York mob, and the parallels he sees in the culture surrounding this president and things he saw at the Ravenite Social Club in the 1980s and 90s in New York. That's fascinating.
Maybe it's worth reading that passage again for people. Here it is. Flashbacks to my earlier career as a prosecutor against the mob. The silent circle of assent. The boss in complete control, the loyalty oaths, the us versus them worldview, the lying about all things, large and small, in service to some code of loyalty that put the organization above morality and above the truth.
Yeah, and again, this is not coming from a partisan Democrat taking cheap shots. This is somebody who's always tried to hold himself above politics.
Yes, but it is coming from somebody who has a score to settle. I mean,
oh, no question about it.
Let me just say one thing, because I think this is really important. The cascade of events that happened because James Comey was fired, okay? We've talked about this in terms of the Robert Mueller investigation. Also, this book. I mean, this book would never have been written had he not been fired. So we have to see
this is why people were warning the president not to fire Comey, because it would set off a series of things. But nonetheless, you have to look at Comey's record. He is a lifelong Republican. Republican appointee, served presidents of both parties honorably in different roles in the Justice and the FBI. So there's real moral authority. So you can't simply dismiss him, or the RNC trying to cheaply go after him with sort of frat boy humor. This is someone whose career has gravitas that you can't dismiss as a part of
But go ahead, David, please.
I agree with that, but we do have to step back and say that Comey got himself into a lot of trouble because of self-inflicted wounds. He tried to manage this email investigation and making certain parts of it public for his own kind of political and media stature under the guise of protecting the FBI. He didn't have to do what he did. It was unprecedented that he shared both things that he thought would be, you know, that Clinton people thought were good for them, as well as stuff that was bad for them. He didn't have to do either of those things. It doesn't mean he should have been fired. And let's remember, he was fired because the president didn't like how the investigation was going. Right. That's a huge problem. That's what still holds true. And, you know, this business of this kind of mob boss mentality that this president has, let's remember as we question some of the events of the past couple of days, how the FBI is going in and seizing records from his lawyer, and how unusual that is. It's also unusual to have a fixer as a lawyer do these outlandish things that nobody believes, making a $130,000 payment to a porn star and recording these conversations. This is what the FBI and Justice Department officials do. They do prosecute people for bank fraud, for wire fraud. They do that stuff in part to make a larger case, perhaps, or just because of those crimes in and of themselves. And so the president and his people can carp about it, but Comey and all these people represent law and order in the country, which is worth standing up for.
Well, that's going to be the open question about this book, though, is whether or not it's about light or it's about heat. I haven't read a ton of these types of books, but this man with his type of stature, John, there's a lot of pettiness in this book. There's a lot of open revenge in this book.
Should we read some?
And yeah, and we do have to remember, Jim Comey did something that the FBI never does. Never does. I mean, I've been working on cases with them for almost 20 years now, and they frustrate you with the we can't confirm or deny, we can't tell you, nothing ever ends. He came out in this, people believed it was self-serving. He's got enemies on both sides. In this book, it'll be interesting to see who it really hurts and who it really helps.
In terms of the more frivolous, I guess, if that's what you want to call it, or as you said, tawdry stuff, do you want to talk about the appearance? Is that what you want to hear about?
Me personally?
Yeah.
I don't want to hear about any of it. But go ahead, because it's going to get a lot of headlines. The PP tape, that's going to get a lot of headlines. It is.
Okay. Here I was trying to avoid.
Happened.
I was trying to avoid that.
It's going to happen. I mean, and it says something about, you know, the culture writ large, that I guarantee you that these clips, the one you're going to read right now and the one about that tape, are going to be the big sell on this book going into it. That tells you something, too.
Maybe, but I mean, I do think that, to your point, this shows that it is James Comey sort of lowering himself when he talks about the president's appearance. Here it is.
Well, go ahead.
This is James Comey's impression of Donald Trump. His face appeared slightly orange, Comey writes, with bright white half moons under his eyes, where I assumed he placed small tanning goggles, and impressively coiffed bright blonde hair, which upon close inspection looked to be all his.
So there's a compliment right there.
Okay.
No, look, first of all,
he's got unique perspective because he's like 6'8", 6'9", so he's...
Yes. But look, I think, you know, you can call this petty. You can say it's evidence of his observational skills developed as an FBI agent. And it's also not terrible writing. He is describing the president as he is seen up close. And I don't think there's anything petty necessarily about describing what somebody looks like.
That's what you want to hear from the former head of the FBI, is his depiction of the president.
Among other things, absolutely, sure. Why not? Look, there's an eye for detail that not every, you know, government bureaucrat or even author would have. So I don't think it's illegitimate. I'm not sure that really this is the great scandal of the book.
Oh, no, I hear you about that, but it's going to set a tone. Go ahead, David.
It's an editor and an excellent writer like a John Avlon saying, hey, Mr. Comey, can you take us in the room? Can you use precise descriptive language to kind of take us into the room? That would help the narrative here.
Definitely. I heard an editor all over that moment.
Right, but you got to remember who your author is. That's all I'm saying. Is you know, you read the books, you know, from the big shot generals and the big shot politicians who are in. It's not the kind of accountants you're used to.
And in very few of these post-administration memoirs is the blood this bad, right? I mean, this is an FBI director who was fired, who's been a controversial figure on both sides of the aisle over the last 18 months. And I'm sure there'll be stuff the Clintons don't like, and the line he tried to walk to explain his decision to release those two memos. But you know, I think you got to see this in context, and this is somebody who, over the course of his career, has clearly stood for law and order and has seemed to be trying to hold herself to a higher standard than he's seen the president held it.
There was something, David, that we hadn't heard before, and that was how the First Lady Melania reacted to the salacious parts of the dossier that were becoming public. And so it's interesting. Here's that excerpt. It bothered him if there was even a 1% chance his wife Melania thought it was true. He just rolled on unprompted, explaining why it couldn't possibly be true, ending by saying he was thinking of asking me to investigate the allegation to prove it was a lie. I said it was up to him. I think that's interesting because, you know, obviously it shows sort of the personal interaction behind all of these salacious headlines, and it does have an impact on real human beings and real relationships.
Well, it does, and it's also fair that President Trump would have a huge reaction to something that he claims is absolutely false and that has been unconfirmed getting into the public domain. There's a lot of sides to this that are understandable, including the president and his supporters' reaction to the idea that there's so much of this that may not be true, that may be off base, that may be unfair to him, including concerns about the investigation and the sprawling aspect of the investigation. You know, that's all fair, I think, and there's so much criticism to be levied at Comey, perhaps his conduct in the book, details in the book, but you've got to go back to some of the base points about what's been alleged, the basis of the investigation, and was it justified to fire him? That's what people are going to examine here.
All right, David Gregory, John Avalon, thank you both very much. So in the book, the fired FBI director, Comey, also claims that President Trump seemed unconcerned about Russia's election interference. In his new book, fired FBI Director James Comey writes about his first meeting with President-elect Donald Trump days before Trump was sworn in which he and other intelligence chiefs briefed Mr. Trump about Russian interference in the 2016 election. Comey says the president-elect did not ask any questions about Russia's threat to America's democracy or how to stop future attacks. Our next guest was present for part of that meeting, former Director of National Intelligence and CNN National Security Analyst James Clapper. Director Clapper, great to have you here this morning. It will be very interesting to bounce off James Comey's impressions that he shares in the book with yours, since you were there for part of these things. The first one I want to bring up is the moment when you all were briefing President Obama about some of the things in the Russian dossier. Let me read this. Obama turned his head to the left and looked directly at me. He raised and lowered both of his eyebrows with emphasis and then looked away. To my mind, his Groucho Marx eyebrow raise was both subtle humor and an expression of concern. It was almost as if he were saying, good luck with that. Do you remember those moments?
I do, yes. As it turns out, the previous Tuesday, January 4th, I was in the Oval, and in fact, as we were walking in, Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, said, say, could you give President Obama a little run-through on the dossier? And I kind of gulped because I wasn't actually prepared to do that, so I gave him sort of a cursory review of it. And I thought President Obama's reaction was very similar to what Jim described in our subsequent meeting when, and I say our, this is Jim, Comey, John Brennan, then Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Admiral Mike Rogers, who was then and still is the Director of NSA. That meeting came later. In my meeting, the President didn't say anything. He just kind of rolled his eyes. And I think you know, body language, facial expressions conveyed volumes, and that. So his reaction to my brief, preliminary, you know, coming attractions was very consistent with what Jim described in our subsequent meeting.
Director Clapper, there's so much in this book. I mean, it's such a commentary on President Trump. It's a commentary on how James Comey thinks President Trump feels about the justice system. And there's all sorts of what some might call some petty details in here. There's some settling of scores. What do you think about James Comey having written this book?
Well, I think it, above all, is a truthful portrayal of how you know, Jim's observations, his feelings, and what occurred. You know, people can take issue with decisions that Jim made and things he did, but in my view, knowing Jim as I do, I think whatever he did it for what he felt were the best reasons and were in the best interest of the country. And of course, I'm kind of comparing notes here because I've got a book coming out next month which also talks about some of the same events, and I'm sure that the same accusations are going to be levied at me as well.
Do you include things about the president's appearance? I'll read a passage, hold on one second, from James Comey's new book. His face appeared slightly orange with bright white half moons under his eyes, where I assumed he placed small tanning goggles, and impressively coiffed, bright blonde hair, which upon close inspection looked to be all his. Do you have details like that in your book?
No, I don't, Allison. Maybe I should have. I don't know. But no, I don't get that specific, although I don't disagree with any of the description, but I didn't include that kind of
I mean, the point is, the reason I ask is because James Comey was always depicted as this career prosecutor, serious man, straight shooter, and so is this the James Comey that you know, to include some of the more salacious details in this book?
Well, Jim didn't generate the salacious details, and so he chose to include, you know, some pretty specific graphic details about his impressions of President Trump. Well, that's the nature of those kind of books. So I don't fault him for it. I just, in my case, chose not to include details like that.
When is the last time that you spoke to James Comey, and what did he tell you about the coming onslaught connected to the book? Well,
we didn't. When last we were in contact was informal dinner that John Brennan and his wife and the Comeys and my wife and me had. We refer to it as the reunion of the Nazis, I guess.
Why is that?
Well, that's the way President-elect Trump characterized us after that 6th January briefing and his news conference on the 11th of January, which is what, of course, occasioned my call to him, which I did more just to defend the men and women of the intelligence community than anything else. So we, as I say, we referred to it as the reunion of the Nazis.
Wow.
I mean,
but when was that? When did you all have this informal dinner? Oh,
this is about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I think we clearly, and certainly Jim understood that there was going to be a firestorm in terms of reacting to the book. Of course, we're all having a discussion about the book, and at least for my part, I haven't read it. All I'm aware of is excerpts that have been reported in the media, but we knew there'd be high interest in it, and you know, this is a period of great controversy, very politically charged, and however you describe it is going to evoke controversy, and I expect there'll be criticisms of what I said too when my book comes out next
Well,
month.
why don't you give us a preview? How are you going to trump this one, so to speak? What are some juicy tidbits in your book?
Well, mine is a longer time span. It goes back over my 50 years in intelligence, and so I discuss my take on Edward Snowden and his aftermath, and the aftermath of what he did, and Benghazi, talk about that, and I guess, you know, from sort of the government's perspective. So it's a broader time span than just focusing on, although I do speak, of course, to the election and the result and the aftermath, which, to be honest, is kind of what motivated me to write a book, and I hadn't planned to do that until all that happened.
Well, that sounds like it will be fascinating. Obviously, we will have you back on to help dissect your book when it comes out. Director
Thank you.
Clapper, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thanks, Allison.
Okay, Chris.
I think we may see a spate of books. This administration is going to generate a lot of people wanting to tell their side of the story, so it seems. All right, after threatening to launch missiles, now we're hearing that President Trump has not decided on how to respond in any way to the suspected chemical attack in Syria. So was that tweet? All right, so we understand the president is going to receive an intelligence briefing today as the White House insists that no final decision has been made on how to respond to the suspected chemical weapons attack in Syria. The president appears to be softening his talk about retaliation. You remember, just a day or so ago, the president was tweeting Russia directly, saying missiles, quote, will be coming. The president tweeted in part that a response could happen, quote, very soon or not soon at all.
President Trump reevaluating his decision to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. The White House confirms that he has asked U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and Chief Economic Advisor Larry Kudlow to look into re-entering TPP. The president withdrew from TPP during his first week in office, claiming it was unfair to American farmers and workers.
President Trump ordering a review of U.S. Postal Service operations and finances. The executive order was signed last night, and it comes just weeks after the president publicly railed against Amazon, claiming the online retailer does not pay its fair share of postage. The task force is going to be led by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and is going to include the Attorney General and Labor Secretary.
President Trump's allies concerned the FBI may have seized recorded conversations when they raided the home.
Sundays at 9 on CNN.
All right, there are new clues on what the FBI may have seized in its search of Trump's personal attorney, Michael Cohen, his office, the hotel room where he and his family were staying. Sources telling CNN Cohen recorded phone conversations during the campaign. It could be on his cell phones or computers, and they were seized by the FBI this week. Back with us, John Avlon, David Gregory. David, how's it hit you?
Well, you know, this could go to explain and, I guess, provide more backup for what the FBI was doing and why this was approved by the Justice Department and the Southern District of New York. As I made this point earlier, you know, if you're making a case, there's lots of spokes here. They could be looking at bank fraud, wiring fraud, maybe as part of making a larger case, or maybe just to go after Michael Cohen because that's where the evidence tanks them. You know, prosecutors do bring bank fraud and wire fraud cases. If he claims preposterously, ask any lawyer, whether he out of his own pocket paid $130,000 to pay off the porn star so that she wouldn't tell about her affair with the candidate who was going to become president. Did he put on his application for the loan that he says he took out on his house that it's to pay hush money to the porn star?
You don't have to do that, though, David. I mean, a HELOC.
You don't have to justify.
No, a HELOC. Yeah. I'm sorry. Home equity line of credit. It's your home, it's your equity. Yeah. The bank makes a decision about how much equity you have and how much they want to lend against it. And then you don't tell them how you want to use the money.
When you're setting up an LLC, as you did, do you have to justify what you're setting up the LLC for?
You have to give it a stated purpose.
Maybe that.
But so you're saying, if he put an alternate explanation that wasn't true, that's not an issue?
I'm saying that when you have a HELOC, no. This matters because a lot of people are saying exactly what we're discussing right now. David, thank you for bringing it up. It's your money when you have a line of credit on your home. You use it for whatever you want. You just have to repay it with the VIG, you know, with the interest rate. It's not like applying for a loan as we would notionally think about it.
Right. I think the clarification is helpful. The point David's making, of course, is that there's a pattern of shady behavior that we're being told is utterly normal in the course of business when we all commonsensically know it's not. The presence of potential tapes, if Michael Cohen indeed was taping conversations over the course of the campaign, which appears to have been a best practice or at least a common threat within the Trump organization, that's problematic. Why? You've got a primary source document they can't spin their way out of. They can't do it he said, she said. And two, Michael Cohen is an incredibly devoted, loyal enforcer and secret keeper to President and then candidate Trump. And he was very unvarnished in his language and tactics, and if those things are caught on tape, well, you live by the tape, you die by the tape, and we found with Nixon, and we may see history repeating itself, but it's not going to look good, odds are.
Well, what I'm saying is, and we're speculating about what they're after, but the point is that there could be a case, maybe there's evidence that they have, of some kind of bank, wire fraud, campaign finance violations. Sure. These are cases that they would bring and that they would make. It may not have anything to do directly with President Trump, but that may be part of this investigation. Yep. No, that's the point.
David, straight on, David. It's the right point to make.
All right, let's move on to Mike Pompeo. As you know, he is on the verge, perhaps, of becoming Secretary of State, but it's questionable now as to whether or not the nomination is in trouble. Some Democrats are more on the fence than we knew. Here's a moment of one of his hearings where he was asked about his position on Iran. Listen to this.
Iran wasn't racing to a weapon before the deal. There is no indication that I'm aware of that if the deal no longer existed, that they would immediately turn to racing to create a nuclear weapon today.
Awfully sanguine, John.
It's jaw-dropping to me that he's that sanguine about the prospect of Iran getting a nuclear bomb when so much partisan heat has been directed at the Obamas for the deal they made. Falsely saying that it will accelerate the process to a nuclear weapon. Also, this is incredibly germane to being Secretary of State. The deadline that President Trump has set up happens to largely overlap in mid-May with the North Korea deal, which also would require some kind of international enforcement. So this is just jaw-dropping on 5 fronts, and it's one of the hurdles Pompeo's facing. On committee, he's got Rand Paul, Republican, Libertarian, saying not going to support him, and 2 Democrats looking unlikely to support him. That creates a math problem. McConnell can override it, but Pompeo's, it's unprecedented to have a Secretary of State, not be confirmed. But this looks like a tougher confirmation than we've seen in a while.
David, you think he helped or hurt himself?
Well, I think he's part of. I think he's a pawn in a larger fight here. I mean, he's controversial in and of himself, but he's part of a larger battle where this is an opportunity for Democrats, to take their frustration out on President Trump. And raise concerns about his foreign policy, about the Mueller investigation, and all the rest. I think Pompeo has an opportunity here to be a very effective member of President Trump's team, very effective for the country, despite some of his views that people may disagree with. He's a Secretary of State who would be on the same page with this president, and the rest of the world would know that, which would be more effective than his predecessor. And, you look at an issue like the Iran deal, this has been controversial from the start. So there's going to be, arguments on both sides of this. I don't know that should be determinative.
And Democrats will have to answer if they vote against him, putting the State Department without someone at its head at a time of maximum international peril.
Yeah. All right. David Gregory, John Avalon, thank you very much. So what do Democrats think about James Comey's explosive tell-all book? Hillary Clinton's former running mate, Senator Tim Kaine, joins us next.
All right, the war is on. The former FBI Director Jim Comey blasting Donald Trump's presidential leadership and excerpts from his explosive tell-all book. This is going to launch a lot of back and forths. And it's also a great opportunity for Allison and I to do one of the things we enjoy most, dramatic readings. Here's some excerpts for you.
All right, here's the first one. The president is unethical and untethered to truth and institutional values. His leadership is transactional, ego-driven, and about personal loyalty. He's not mincing words here.
No, but I think I can do better on the drama.
Oh, okay.
You're being way too journalistic with this.
You're right.
Comey goes on to say he's like a mafia boss in his demand for loyalty. Writing, Trump gave him, quote, flashbacks to my earlier career as a prosecutor against the mob, the silent circle of assent, the boss in complete control.
Shouldn't you do this with an accent?
The loyalty oaths. He doesn't have one. I do. The U.S. versus them worldview. The lying about all things, large and small, in service to some code of loyalty that put the organization above morality and above the truth.
I think you missed the Tony Soprano moment, opportunity there.
But Comey doesn't sound like that. I'm in his voice.
I see. I got you.
You got to stay in character.
Good motivation. I understand. We are obviously making light of some of this. It's a bombshell. And James Comey, I mean, he includes some juicy tidbits, I think, that some might say are petty or salacious. But also, I mean, to have the former head of the FBI, a man like James Comey, who was known as a straight shooter, talk about the president being untethered to the truth. And unethical. The president of the United States.
Yes.
I mean, there's no way to see this other than as a bombshell.
Unprecedented. But the reason this is an okay aspect of the book to play with this way is that that's how it's going to be taken in. This is the heat part of the book. The light part of the book, what it sheds on the investigation and what it means going forward, that will be dealt with deadly seriousness. All right, so joining us now is Hillary Clinton's former running mate, Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, a member of the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees. Senator, an important morning to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, Chris. Good to be with you guys.
So from what you understand about the book so far, what is of interest to you, sir?
Just the excerpts that I've read, this untethered to truth line just, has a complete ring of truth to it based on what we've seen in the first 15, 16 months of the administration. And also I thought it was interesting that Director Comey is sort of analogizing the Trump team to like mob folks that he's prosecuted. I've always thought it was interesting, Chris, in this investigation about Russian collusion. It kind of sounds like an espionage case, but I've always thought of these guys, they're a little more like mob types than spies, because the bling, the braggadocio, the over-opulent kind of glitzy stuff. I mean, so when Comey talked about it as a little bit like a mob organization, that also has the ring of truth to it.
One more beat on this, if you would indulge me, Senator, and then I want to move on to what's going on with the confirmation process, and you know what I'm going to ask you about in terms of the Syria conflict. So the usefulness of this book, everybody will take it in through their own lens of what they're looking for in it. What is your bar for satisfaction?
Well, you were leading in with an interesting way. I'm sure there will be heat. The question will there be light? There will be some juicy excerpts, I'm sure. But look, we're in a tough time right now. We're grappling with this Mueller investigation. Even today, the president is announcing that he's going to pardon Scooter Libby. Why pardon Scooter Libby today? People have forgotten about Scooter Libby. The pardoning of somebody who is convicted of obstruction for justice working in the White House, I think is more about sending a message to people today than it is about a case that's 10 years old. So we're in a very, very challenging time right now. And I don't know if the book will offer us, who are in the House and Senate, any guidance about what we have to do, but it may help the American public understand the completely unprecedented times we're living in and the high stakes that our institutions stand up and defend the values of the country against some significant internal crisis.
We'll see. And of course, Comey's handcuffed by confidentiality and classified information with an ongoing investigation.
Indeed.
So we'll see how much light there can be in it at this point. So, Senator, Mike Pompeo, up for confirmation. Interesting politics involved here. Maybe they take it out of committee and put it to a vote on the floor. That's going to be a little inside baseball for people. There's a bigger headline. So after all of the attacks from the right, and some of them with great justification, that, boy, you shouldn't have done this Iran deal because they're going to make this bomb anyway. It's too weak. They can get around it. This is a bad deal. Mike Pompeo gets up there and says, I have no reason to believe that they are in any rush to create any kind of nuclear device, deal or no deal. Jaw dropper.
It was it was funny, Chris. That was my thought during his testimony yesterday. It was a jaw dropper. He said, that before the deal was done, Iran wasn't rushing to a deal, and he doesn't think they're likely to rush to a bomb, and he doesn't think they're likely to. And he also said he completely accepts the notion that Iran is actually complying with the deal. Those were both pretty big headline moments, although I think there were other aspects of the testimony that got a little more attention, but those were the light-producing moments of the hearing, if you will.
Do you think he helped himself or hurt himself?
Here is his challenge with me. Every Democrat on the committee had voted against Mike Pompeo for CIA director, except for Jeanne Shaheen and me. I voted for him to head the CIA, and don't wish I had that vote back. I think he has a background in intel and has been a good, solid manager there. But what I really doubted going into the hearing is, where is this guy's predisposition toward diplomacy? I said during the hearing, a lot of people said they didn't like the Iran deal. You were the only one saying, I don't like the deal. And, oh, by the way, it's only going to take 2,000 bombing runs to wipe out Iran's nuclear capacity. I just don't see much evidence of diplomacy in Mike Pompeo, and especially with this president. I think the Secretary of State should be somebody who really has a lean toward diplomacy.
Does Tim Kaine know how he's going to vote?
I'm still weighing it, but I'll tell you, I walked in with serious questions, and they weren't really laid to rest yesterday by his testimony.
Senator Shaheen, what do you know about where she is?
I think Jeanne has some similar concerns to mine. I would let her speak for herself. I haven't talked to her since the hearing was over about where she's thinking right now.
All right. Of course, it's the red state Democrats we're going to have to watch because they have a different set of politics involved in this potential vote than you and Shaheen. Let me ask you this. Well, not Shaheen so much, you. So the AUMF, Paul Ryan says the president does not need to come to Congress to bomb Syria. Where in the AUMF, which, by the way, doesn't supersede the War Powers Act by definition within its own language, where is this an attack on a terrorist organization that is a direct threat to the United States? Who in Congress is going to stand up and say, Mr. President, please formulate your plans. You cannot execute them without our vote of authorization?
Paul Ryan is wrong. I'm going to stand up and have been saying, if the president launches missile strikes against Syria without coming to Congress, it's illegal. it is illegal, because we've given the president, through the 2001 and 02 AUMFs, the power to fight against non-state terrorist organizations if they can be somehow connected to the bombing of 9/11. But Syria as a nation was not connected to the bombing of 9/11. Syria has not declared war on the United States. There's no international legal justification for carrying out a war on Syrian soil. Is Bashar al-Assad a dictator? Absolutely. Should we use tough action, including military action, to stop him from using chemical weapons against civilians? We sure should, but not without a vote of Congress. And so you will see in the next day, I think likely today or in the next couple of days, Senator Corker, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, and I have been working on a new authorization that would try to clarify the U.S. military actions against non-state terrorist groups, but specify that that authorization does not apply to military action against a sovereign nation.
There are a lot of risks involved. Everybody's got to be weighed and measured on this one, Senator. We'll stay on it.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us. We'll have you back on this.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Take care.
We will. Allison.
We'll have much more ahead on James Comey's explosive tell-all book. How will President Trump respond?